USS Scorpion, hull number 589, sat 2 miles down in the Atlantic, and for 5 months, no one on Earth knew exactly where. By 1968, the United States Navy had spent nearly 2 decades building the most sophisticated fleet of nuclear submarines the world had ever seen. Vessels that could vanish beneath the waves for months, track an enemy in silence, and return home on schedule every time. 5 years earlier, USS Thresher had gone down with all hands, and the Navy had done something unprecedented. It explained why. A rigorous new inspection program, SubSafe, was built from the wreckage. Every valve, every weld, every seal was recertified. The lesson was absorbed. The Navy did not just recover. It explained, corrected, and moved forward. That was the law by 1968. American submarines were tracked, accounted for, and when something went wrong, the Navy found out why, even if the answer stayed classified. Then Scorpion missed its return to Norfolk. No distress call. No debris field on the surface. No warning. 99 men were simply overdue, and the largest submarine search in Navy history began without knowing whether it was hunting for survivors or a grave. More than 50 years later, the Navy still has not agreed on what happened to USS Scorpion. Not for lack of trying. For lack of an answer everyone could accept. By 1968, USS Scorpion was 8 years into service, commissioned July 29, 1960. One of 6 skipjack-class attack submarines the Navy had built to solve a single problem: speed underwater. The skipjacks borrowed their teardrop-shaped hull from an experimental research vessel called USS Albacore, a shape optimized purely for submerged performance rather than the surface running. Paired with a single nuclear reactor, that hull let Scorpion do something no diesel submarine of the previous generation could: outrun a destroyer while fully submerged. She measured 251 feet, 8 inches, displaced roughly 3,500 tons submerged, and carried a crew rated at 99 officers and enlisted men. Her armament was conventional for the era but lethal in practice: Mark 37 and Mark 14 torpedoes, fired from 4 bow tubes, designed to hunt surface ships and enemy submarines alike. Homeported in Norfolk, Virginia, Scorpion spent the 1960s doing exactly what a Cold War attack submarine was built to do: disappearing. She tracked Soviet naval movements in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, surfaced rarely, and reported even more rarely. Silence was not a malfunction. Silence was the mission. In command was Commander Francis Atwood Slattery. 35 years old, a Naval Academy graduate with a decade of submarine service behind him, Slattery had taken command of Scorpion in June 1967, inheriting a boat with a service record that was solid but not spotless. Mechanical issues had surfaced during earlier patrols, the kind of wear any nuclear submarine accumulates after nearly a decade of hard use. None of it had been considered disqualifying. Submarines broke down. Submarines got fixed. That was the pattern, and nothing about the Scorpion in early 1968 suggested she would be the exception. The crew Slattery commanded skewed young, as submarine crews did. Many enlisted men in their early 20s, several on their first or second deployment, trained in a service that demanded technical fluency few civilian jobs required at that age. Nuclear reactor operators, sonar technicians, torpedo men, each specialized, each essential, each trusting the boat and the chain of command above them to bring them home. 99 men, most of them barely old enough to legally drink in some states, operating one of the most advanced weapon systems on the planet. In February 1968, Scorpion deployed to the Mediterranean as part of a routine 6th Fleet surveillance operation, shadowing Soviet naval activity, in a theater where American and Soviet submarines regularly passed within miles of each other, without either side officially acknowledging it. The deployment played out largely as expected. Reports were filed. Positions were logged. By May, the assignment was complete, and Scorpion received orders that should have been the least remarkable part of the entire patrol: return to Norfolk. It was a transit every submarine in the fleet had made dozens of times. Home was 4,600 nautical miles away. The estimated time was roughly a week. Nothing about the orders suggested Scorpion would not arrive. On May 16, 1968, 5 days before Scorpion's scheduled arrival home, naval intelligence intercepted increased Soviet naval activity in the eastern Atlantic. A cluster of Soviet surface ships and at least one submarine operating near the Canary Islands, conducting what appeared to be a research or surveillance mission of their own. Scorpion, still en route from the Mediterranean, was ordered to divert and observe. This was not unusual. Attack submarines transiting home were routinely tasked with intelligence stops along the way. A detour of a few days to photograph, record acoustic signatures, and report on Soviet vessel movements before resuming course. Scorpion altered heading, closed on the Soviet group, completed the surveillance, and turned back west toward Norfolk. By all available records, the diversion went exactly as planned. No irregularities were reported. No distress signals were sent. On May 21, 1968, at approximately 12:44 p.m. Eastern Time, Naval Communications Station, Nea Makri in Greece, received a routine status message from Scorpion. The submarine reported her position roughly 250 miles south of the Azores, confirmed that she had completed her Canary Islands tasking, and stated her intention to proceed directly to Norfolk. Expected arrival date May 27, 1968. It was an unremarkable transmission. A position, a status, an estimated time of arrival. The kind of message a submarine crew sent without a second thought, because there had never been a reason to think twice about it. It was also the last confirmed communication anyone would ever receive from USS Scorpion. For the next 6 days, Scorpion continued her transit in accordance with standard submarine doctrine, running submerged for extended periods, maintaining radio silence except for scheduled reporting windows, trusting that the ocean between the Azores and Norfolk held no surprises a nuclear attack submarine couldn't handle. This was routine. This was the job. 989 men, 1 reactor, 1 heading, west. May 27 arrived. Norfolk's submarine piers, where families had gathered before to welcome boats home from 6-month deployments, waited for Scorpion to surface. She did not. In the Navy's own operational logic, a missed arrival was not immediately treated as catastrophe. Submarines ran late. Weather slowed transits. Mechanical issues forced course adjustments. Standard procedure allowed for a grace period before declaring a vessel overdue. And for the first hours past the scheduled arrival, Scorpion's absence registered as a delay, not a disaster. But hours became a full day. A full day became 2. And a nuclear attack submarine, one of the fastest, most capable vessels the United States Navy possessed, a boat built to outrun destroyers and vanish beneath the waves at will, remained silent somewhere in 4,500 nautical miles of open Atlantic Ocean, with no one able to say where. On May 29, 1968, the Navy made a declaration it had hoped never to issue twice in 1 decade. USS Scorpion was officially declared missing. The declaration triggered an operation the Navy had built specifically for this nightmare, SubMiss, the standing protocol for a submarine overdue and unaccounted for. Within hours it escalated further, to sub-sunk, the designation used when a submarine was presumed lost. Not merely delayed. The distinction mattered. Submiss assumed the boat might still surface. Sub-sunk assumed it would not. The search that followed was, at the time, one of the largest peacetime naval operations ever conducted. Surface ships fanned out across the projected transit corridor between the Azores and Norfolk, a stretch of open Atlantic roughly the size of a small country, with no fixed point to search from beyond a single radio transmission 6 days old. Aircraft flew grid patterns overhead, scanning for any surface debris, an oil slick, a life raft, anything that would narrow 4,500 nautical miles down to a coordinate. Destroyers and support vessels crossed and recrossed sectors of ocean that had, until that week, meant nothing to anyone outside a navigation chart. For weeks, the search found nothing. No wreckage surfaced, no emergency beacon activated, no debris field marked a location on the water, the way sailors and rescue crews had learned to expect when something went wrong at sea. Scorpion had not simply sunk near the surface, where a catastrophic failure might leave a visible trace. If she was gone completely. Somewhere on the ocean floor, in water deep enough that conventional search methods, built for finding ships near the surface, were effectively useless. The Navy turned to a different kind of listening, the sound surveillance system, known as SOSUS, a classified network of underwater hydrophones, originally built to track Soviet submarines across the Atlantic, had been recording continuously through late May 1968. Buried in that recorded data was an acoustic event. A sharp anomalous sound picked up by a SOSUS station, logged automatically, and initially unremarked upon, because in a system built to detect enemy submarines, it did not immediately register as anything belonging to Scorpion. It would take investigators weeks to go back through the recordings, isolate the signature, and calculate a probable location from the timing and triangulation of the sound across multiple listening stations. The families of the crew, meanwhile, waited in a version of limbo the Navy had no procedure to soften. Wives and parents in Norfolk had prepared for a homecoming, a scheduled arrival, a pier, a reunion. Instead, they were told their husbands and sons were overdue, a word that carried no certainty in either direction. For weeks, there was no confirmation of death, and no realistic hope of survival either, because everyone involved in the search understood what 6 days of silence from a nuclear submarine almost certainly meant, even before anyone was willing to say it publicly. By the end of June 1968, more than a month after Scorpion's last transmission, the surface search had exhausted its usefulness. Ships could not find what wasn't floating. Aircraft could not spot what wasn't visible from the air. If Scorpion was going to be found at all, it would not be by anyone looking at the surface of the ocean. It would require looking 2 miles beneath it. The vessel that found her was not built for tragedy. USS Mizar was a Navy research and survey ship, originally designed for oceanographic work, mapping the seafloor, studying deep ocean currents, towing instrument sleds across stretches of the Atlantic that had never been photographed. In 1966, Mizar had played a role in locating a lost hydrogen bomb off the coast of Spain after a mid-air collision between two Air Force aircraft, an operation that proved the ship's deep-sea camera sleds could find small, specific objects in total darkness, under crushing pressure, thousands of feet down. 2 years later, that same capability was turned toward finding a 3,500-ton submarine and the 99 men inside it. Mizar's search method was methodical to the point of tedium. A sled equipped with cameras and lights was towed just above the ocean floor, moving in slow, overlapping passes across a search area, narrowed down using the SOSUS acoustic data. The anomalous sound recorded on May 22nd, now understood as the probable moment Scorpion was lost. Each pass captured thousands of still photographs. Each set of photographs had to be developed, reviewed, and cross-referenced by analysts looking for anything that broke the pattern of empty seafloor. A shape, a shadow, a straight line where nature produced only curves. The search area sat roughly 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores, in water approximately 10,000 feet deep, nearly 2 miles down, in near total darkness, at pressure that would crush an unpressurized hull instantly. It was not a place any recovery vessel of the era could send divers. It was not a place anything could reach except cameras, sleds, and later, submersibles capable of operating at extreme depth. In late October 1968, 5 months after Scorpion's last transmission, Mizar's cameras finally captured what analysts had spent the entire summer searching for. The wreckage lay scattered across the ocean floor, broken into sections. Photographs showed the submarine's hull split, with debris spread across a field extending several hundred feet. The signature of a vessel that had not simply flooded and sunk intact, but had suffered a violent structural failure, either from internal explosion, catastrophic pressure hull collapse, or some combination investigators would spend years trying to sequence in the correct order. The exact depth at the debris field was recorded at approximately 9,800 feet. Later expeditions, including deep submergence vehicles, like the bathyscaphe Trieste in 1969, returned to the site to photograph the wreckage in greater detail, attempting to reconstruct exactly how the hull had failed and in what sequence. What those images showed was unambiguous on one point and deeply ambiguous on another. Scorpion was destroyed, catastrophically and completely, somewhere between the Azores and the American coast. But the photographs, even the clearest, closest images anyone would ever capture of the wreck, could not by themselves answer the question that mattered most. They showed what had happened to the submarine. They could not show why. For the Navy, the discovery closed one investigation and opened another, more difficult one. A missing submarine had become a confirmed wreck, ending the agonizing uncertainty of the search, but replacing it with a different kind of uncertainty, one that would prove far harder to resolve. Finding Scorpion had taken 5 months. Understanding what killed her would take the Navy considerably longer, and by some measures, it has never finished. The Navy convened its court of inquiry within days of the wreckage discovery. Following the same formal process it had used after Thresher 5 years earlier, a board of senior naval officers was assembled, tasked with a single mandate: determine as precisely as the evidence allowed what had caused the loss of USS Scorpion and the deaths of all 99 men aboard. On paper, the process looked identical to the one that had produced clear answers before. In practice, it would not. The court convened its first formal session in June 1968, even before Miser had located the wreck, taking testimony from officers who had served with Scorpion, engineers familiar with her systems, and specialists in submarine acoustics and structural failure. Once the wreckage was found in October and photographed in the following months, the board's work shifted from theoretical reconstruction to analysis of physical evidence, as much as photographs from 2 miles down could provide. In January 1969, the Court of Inquiry issued its findings. The board's official conclusion stated that the certain cause of the loss could not be conclusively determined from the evidence available. This was, in itself, an unusual outcome for a Navy investigation. Thresher's Court of Inquiry had identified a specific chain of failure: a piping joint, a chain reaction of flooding, and a reactor shut down, and turned that failure into a fleet-wide safety program. Scorpion's board, working with far less physical access to the wreck and a debris field that raised more questions than it answered, could not produce the same kind of definitive chain. What the board could do was rule out some possibilities and rank others by plausibility. Internally, investigators reportedly leaned toward one theory more than others: a malfunction involving one of Scorpion's own Mark 37 torpedoes, potentially activating unexpectedly while still in its tube or shortly after failing to eject properly, triggering a chain of destruction inside the hull. But leaned toward was not the same as concluded, and the distinction was preserved carefully in the board's language. The official record stopped short of naming a definitive cause. The public in 1969 received only a fraction of what the Court of Inquiry had actually examined. The Navy released a summary of the findings, enough to state that Scorpion was lost with all hands, that a court of inquiry had convened, and that a probable cause had been considered but not proven beyond reasonable certainty. The full transcripts, the detailed engineering analysis, the raw acoustic data from SOSUS, and significant portions of the board's internal deliberations were classified. Some material was marked secret. Other material disappeared into Navy archives without any public accounting of what it contained at all. The stated justification followed a familiar Cold War logic. Detailed information about Scorpion's acoustic signature, her operational capabilities, and the specific mechanics of the SOSUS detection system that had helped locate her wreck was considered sensitive on national security grounds. Not because of what it revealed about the past, but because of what it might reveal about the present. If the Navy explained exactly how sound recorded through an underwater listening network had pinpointed a submarine's final moments, it would also be explaining, in effect, how that same network could be used to track any submarine, American or Soviet, anywhere in the Atlantic. The classification wasn't only about protecting an investigation, it was about protecting a surveillance capability the Cold War depended on. For the families of the 99 men lost, this left a gap that no amount of official language could close. They had a court of inquiry. They had a conclusion that stopped short of being a conclusion. They did not have access to the reasoning behind it, the alternative theories considered and dismissed, or the specific evidence that had led investigators toward, but never fully onto, a single explanation. 3 years after Thresher, the Navy had shown it could take a catastrophic loss, investigate it completely, and hand the public and the families of the dead a clear, documented answer. With Scorpion, the same institution, using largely the same process, produced something structurally different, an official finding that acknowledged its own uncertainty, sealed behind a level of classification that made independent verification nearly impossible. The Court of Inquiry did not close the case. It filed it away, unresolved, and left the door open for every theory that would follow. In the decades following the Court of Inquiry's inconclusive verdict, 3 theories emerged as the dominant explanations for Scorpion's loss, each argued by credible investigators, each supported by real evidence, and none ever proven to the exclusion of the others. The first theory centered on the weapon Scorpion carried into every patrol, the Mark 37 torpedo. This theory held that a torpedo inside one of Scorpion's tubes experienced a malfunction, either a battery-related failure or an electrical fault, that caused it to activate its own arming and propulsion sequence while still aboard the submarine. If the torpedo could not be safely ejected or disarmed in time, its own warhead detonation, or the resulting fire and secondary explosions, could have breached the pressure hull from the inside, at a depth where any breach was immediately catastrophic. Proponents of this theory pointed to Scorpion's documented history of technical issues with torpedo systems in the years before her loss, and to acoustic data that some analysts interpreted as consistent with an internal explosion sequence rather than a single simultaneous hull collapse. It was, notably, the theory the Court of Inquiry itself appeared to favor internally, without ever stating it as a formal proven conclusion. The second theory pointed not to a weapon but to the ship's own power system, a battery explosion in Scorpion's silver-zinc battery banks, used for backup and emergency power. Silver-zinc batteries of the era were known to be volatile under certain fault conditions, capable of generating explosive hydrogen gas if damaged or improperly maintained. Under this theory, a battery-related fire or explosion in a confined space aboard the submarine could have triggered flooding, loss of control, and a rapid and uncontrolled descent past the hull's crush depth, the point at which ocean pressure would tear the submarine apart before any human intervention could have stopped it. Investigators who favored this explanation noted prior incidents of battery-related problems on other submarines of similar design, arguing that Scorpion's own history made this failure mode entirely plausible, independent of any torpedo malfunction at all. The third theory was the one that refused to disappear from public conversation, regardless of how little verified evidence supported it directly: the possibility of Soviet involvement. This theory gained traction largely because of timing. In March 1968, just 2 months before Scorpion vanished, a Soviet Golf-class submarine, K-129, had been lost in the Pacific under its own unexplained circumstances, an incident that would later become notorious when the CIA attempted a covert recovery operation known as Project Azorian. Some researchers and journalists working from Cold War-era tensions and the coincidence of near-simultaneous submarine losses on opposite sides of the world speculated that Scorpion's loss might have been connected to Soviet retaliation, surveillance operations gone wrong, or even direct hostile action during her documented diversion to observe Soviet naval activity near the Canary Islands days before her disappearance. No declassified evidence has ever confirmed direct Soviet action against Scorpion. No Soviet vessel has ever been definitively placed in a position to have caused her loss through hostile engagement, and no acoustic or physical evidence recovered from the wreck has been publicly presented as proof of an external attack. The theory persists less because of what has been proven, and more because of what has never been fully ruled out, a distinction that matters enormously to historians, and matters just as much to families, who have spent decades wanting a definitive answer rather than a plausible one. Each of these 3 theories has genuine adherents among former Navy officers, submarine engineers, investigative journalists, and researchers who have spent years studying the declassified fragments of the record. Each theory is internally coherent. Each is consistent with at least some of the physical evidence recovered from the wreck site. And critically, none of them has ever been elevated by the Navy or by any independent investigative body, to the status of a confirmed, publicly documented cause. This is the detail that separates Scorpion from nearly every other major submarine loss in American naval history. Thresher had one accepted explanation. Nearly every documented submarine disaster before or since has eventually produced a consensus, imperfect, sometimes contested at the margins, but a consensus nonetheless. A single narrative that investigators, historians, and the public could largely agree on. Scorpion never reached that point. More than 5 decades after the Court of Inquiry issued its inconclusive findings, credible investigators still disagree, publicly and substantively, on which of these 3 theories, or some combination of them, actually explains what happened in the final moments before Scorpion's hull failed, somewhere in the North Atlantic, on a day in late May 1968. The ocean kept the wreckage. It did not keep the answer. For decades, what separated Scorpion's mystery from ordinary historical uncertainty was not a lack of evidence. It was the deliberate, sustained decision to keep most of that evidence out of public view. The Court of Inquiry's 1969 findings were only ever released to the public in summary form, a document stripped of the underlying testimony, technical analysis, and acoustic data that had actually informed the board's conclusions. The full record remained classified under national security provisions, filed away inside Navy archives, with no public timeline for release and no formal mechanism, at the time, for outside researchers to challenge that classification. For nearly 2 decades after Scorpion's loss, the official position of the United States Navy was, functionally, unchanged. An inconclusive verdict, delivered once, in 1969, and left to stand without amendment or elaboration. The justification the Navy offered was consistent and, on its own terms, defensible. Much of the classified material touched directly on SOSUS, the underwater acoustic surveillance network that had helped locate Scorpion's wreck, and that remained throughout the 1970s and well into the Cold War's later years. One of the most sensitive intelligence capabilities the United States possessed, detailing exactly how SOSUS had detected and triangulated the acoustic event associated with Scorpion's loss, would have meant explaining in technical terms accessible to any interested government precisely how the system worked, how sensitive its detection thresholds were, and how difficult or easy it might be for an adversary submarine to avoid it. In the calculus of Cold War intelligence, protecting that capability was treated as more urgent than resolving a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old mystery about how 99 men had died. This left investigators and journalists working from what amounted to institutional scraps. Freedom of Information Act requests, first filed by independent researchers and members of the press. The press, beginning in the 1970s, produced only partial results. Documents came back with entire pages blacked out. Some requests were denied and outright, citing ongoing national security classifications that showed no sign of expiring. Others produced material that raised new questions without answering old ones. Internal memos referencing analysis that had apparently been conducted, but whose actual findings remained withheld under separate classification. The pattern that emerged over the following decades was one of grinding, incremental disclosure rather than any single moment of transparency. A batch of documents released in the late 1980s, another partial release in the 1990s, coinciding with broader Cold War-era declassification efforts across the federal government. As the Soviet Union collapsed, and some of the original security rationale for withholding information began, at least theoretically, to weaken, each release added detail. None delivered resolution. Researchers who had spent years filing requests and cross-referencing newly released fragments against the 1969 summary found themselves accumulating more raw material without ever arriving at the kind of clean, singular narrative the Navy had produced for Thresher. By the early 2000s, more than 3 decades after Scorpion's loss, journalists and naval historians working independently of the Navy had assembled a far more detailed picture of the search, the wreck, and the internal debate among original Court of Inquiry investigators than the 1969 public summary had ever provided. But detail was not the same as certainty. The additional documents revealed disagreement within the Navy's own investigative community, evidence that some members of the original Court of Inquiry had privately favored the torpedo malfunction theory more strongly than the official summary suggested, while others had reportedly remained unconvinced, arguing the evidence was too ambiguous to support any single conclusion with confidence. In other words, the secrecy had not been hiding a clear answer that the Navy simply declined to share. The secrecy, once partially lifted, revealed genuine documented disagreement among the very people responsible for determining the cause in the first place. This distinction mattered enormously to how the mystery was understood going forward. A cover-up implies a known truth being concealed. What the declassified record actually suggested was something more unsettling in its own way. An investigation that, even with full access to the evidence, classified and unclassified alike, may never have produced a definitive answer at all, because the physical evidence itself, gathered from a debris field 2 miles down and photographed by cameras that could observe but not interrogate, was never sufficient to settle the question beyond reasonable doubt. The wall of secrecy had not been hiding certainty. It had been hiding the absence of it. For the families of the 99 men lost aboard Scorpion, the passage of decades did not resolve the loss. It simply changed its shape, from acute grief in 1968 to a slower generational campaign for answers that outlasted many of the widows, parents, and siblings who began it. In the immediate aftermath, the families received what the Navy offered in 1968 and 1969. Notification of death, survivor benefits processed through the standard military channels, and a memorial service held for the crew as a group, since there were no individual remains to bury. For many, that was the extent of official engagement. The Court of Inquiry's findings, delivered in a public summary stripped of underlying detail, were the only formal explanation most families would receive for years, a document that told them their husbands, sons, and fathers had died, but not conclusively why. Some family members accepted this as the unavoidable cost of a husband's or son's chosen profession. Service in a silent, dangerous branch of the military where risk was understood and, to some degree, accepted as part of the commitment. Others could not, and would not, let the question rest. Beginning in the 1970s, as the first Freedom of Information Act requests were filed by journalists and independent researchers, some Scorpion family members began submitting their own formal requests, seeking access to any Navy records concerning their specific relative's death, arguing that next of kin held a distinct standing separate from general public curiosity. The results were, for years, largely the same as what independent researchers received: partial documents, redacted pages, and polite institutional language explaining that most of the material remained classified in the interest of national security. For families seeking closure, this response carried a particular kind of cruelty. The sense that the government they, or their relatives, had served was treating their grief as a security risk to be managed rather than a loss to be explained. The 1980s and 1990s brought incremental change, driven less by any single dramatic breakthrough than by the accumulated pressure of persistent requests, congressional inquiries prompted by constituent complaints, and the broader wave of Cold War-era declassification that swept through federal agencies. As the geopolitical rationale for secrecy began to shift, some family members who had begun their advocacy as young widows or children in 1968 were, by the 1990s, grandparents themselves, still filing requests, still following up on partial disclosures, still waiting for a level of detail the Navy had never fully provided. Independent researchers played a critical complementary role throughout this period. Investigative journalists who specialized in Cold War naval history filed their own FOIA requests, cross-referenced newly released material against the original 1969 summary, and in several cases published findings that added meaningfully to public understanding of the case. Details about the internal Court of Inquiry debate, about the specific SOSUS acoustic signature, about the competing theories investigators had actually weighed, even when they could not deliver the single conclusive answer families were seeking. This work did not come from within the Navy. It came from outside it, built patiently over years by people with no institutional obligation to keep digging, who kept digging anyway. By the 2010s, further document releases, Some obtained through renewed FOIA efforts, others through formal declassification review processes required periodically under federal law, added still more detail to the public record. Analysts gained access to additional acoustic data, additional internal Navy correspondence, and additional context around the Court of Inquiry's internal deliberations. For researchers who had followed the case for decades, each release was genuinely significant, filling in gaps that had persisted since 1969. But for the families who had started this fight as young spouses and children, more than 50 years earlier, the accumulating detail arrived too gradually and too incompletely to deliver what they had actually wanted from the beginning. Not more documents, but a definitive answer, stated plainly, about how their relatives had died. Many of the original widows and parents did not live to see even the partial declassifications of the 2000s and 2010s. Their children and grandchildren, in some cases, inherited both the grief and the advocacy, filing requests their parents had begun, attending memorial ceremonies their grandparents had once organized, keeping alive a question the United States Navy had never definitively closed. 99 men went to sea in May 1968 and did not come home. More than 5 decades later, some of their descendants are still waiting for the government they served to finish explaining why. Every other major American submarine loss of the nuclear era eventually arrived at a destination Scorpion never reached. Consensus. Thresher's 1963 disaster produced SubSafe, a rigorous new certification program built directly from the Court of Inquiry's specific documented findings. A piping failure, a chain of flooding and reactor shutdown, understood clearly enough to fix. Every submarine built or refitted after 1963 carries the direct engineering legacy of that clarity. The Navy knew what killed Thresher, and it used that knowledge to make certain nothing identical could happen again. Scorpion offered no equivalent gift to the fleet that followed her. Because the Court of Inquiry could not conclusively determine a single cause, no comparable safety program emerged bearing her name. No specific design flaw was identified and corrected across the submarine force. No piping joint, no valve, no procedural failure was singled out as the definitive lesson later submariners would train against. The most the Navy could offer was a probable theory, favored internally but never formally proven, and a classified record that took decades to even partially surface. This is the honest verdict history has to render on the case. Scorpion is not a story of institutional cover-up, in the conspiratorial sense the phrase usually implies. The declassified record, gathered slowly across 5 decades of FOIA requests and periodic government review, does not reveal a hidden truth the Navy knew and suppressed. It reveals genuine documented disagreement among the investigators themselves, naval officers and engineers examining the same wreckage, the same acoustic data, the same fragmentary evidence, and arriving at different defensible conclusions about what had actually happened. 2 miles beneath the Atlantic, what the classification did accomplish, whether intended or not, was to prevent the public, and the families most entitled to clarity, from understanding that uncertainty for what it was. A sealed record looks from the outside like a hidden answer. It took decades of incremental declassification to reveal that what had actually been sealed was an open question the Navy's own investigators had never fully resolved among themselves. The parallel with K-129, the Soviet submarine lost in the Pacific just 2 months before Scorpion, sharpens this point rather than resolving it. 2 nuclear-armed superpowers, at the height of Cold War tension, each lost a submarine within weeks of the other, and each institution handled the aftermath according to its own instincts for secrecy. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged K-129's loss, with anything approaching the detail the American Court of Inquiry eventually provided for Scorpion, and the CIA's own covert recovery attempt, Project Azorian, remained classified for even longer than the Scorpion record. 2 governments, 2 silent submarines, 2 decades-long silences, different in scale and method, but built from the same Cold War logic that treated underwater capability as more valuable to protect than public certainties was to provide. Scorpion's through line into the present is not a corporate one, and not a technical one in the way Thresher's was, Omni runs instead through policy, through the FOIA reform efforts partly shaped by decades of family and journalist advocacy on cases exactly like this one, through the modern expectation, however imperfectly honored, that military institutions eventually owe the public and the bereaved a fuller accounting than a single-page summary. Every subsequent case, where a government agency withholds a definitive explanation behind a wall of classification, inherits some version of the tension Scorpion first established: the public's right to know, set against an institution's calculation of what knowledge is safe to release. Thresher answered a question. Scorpion left one open, and the not knowing became its own kind of history.